Hey everyone, it's Andy from Be Kind Homestead here, and today's video is the much anticipated part 2 to growing plants indoors successfully. In this video, I'm going to go over everything you need to do to care for the plants indoors to have them flourish. I did put up a video of starting the seeds, and they actually are these seeds that I started inside. You could look back at that one if you want to see my whole setup and everything that I did to germinate these seeds and to get them going up to the point of the first true leaves growing. This video is going to cover from that point on to now, which is when they get transplanted up into these pots, and these are actually ready to get hardened off outside when they're done in here. Almost immediately after the seeds germinate and show any signs of actually being a plant, you want to start the hardening off process. Now, if you're asking what the hardening off process is, it's actually preparing plants to be able to go from this stable, calm, barely moving wind environment to a treacherous outdoor environment where it's going to face things it won't face in here, like wind, like heavy rain, possibly, like some drought. All of those things won't happen here. I can control the environment perfectly. So, hardening off is really slowly transitioning plants from this state where they're in a comfy environment and can just grow crazy without any wind resistance or anything to actually getting them ready so that when you put them outside, it's not such a shock to them that they just fall over and die. Very important step to hardening off the plants, and one that I think is one of the most important, is to have an oscillating fan on them on a regular basis. Personally, when I say a regular basis, I have a fan running on the plants all day while the lights are on. The fans are actually set to the same timer as the lights. I have it oscillating, and I recommend that because you don't want constant wind blowing on the plants. You want them to get a little bit of a break, but you do want regular airflow. And that's to do two things. It will dry out the top of the soil so that it doesn't get moldy and fungus gnats and things like that in there. So it circulates the air and keeps a healthy environment in that way. But it also will blow the plants themselves over. And when that happens, it tells the plant to make a stronger stem. And that's really the key to hardening off, is you're trying to harden off these stems so that when they go outside and the wind hits them, they won't just flop over and die. It doesn't have to be blowing the thing over and going crazy or anything like that. You just want it to make the top of the plants dance around a little bit when the fan blows on it. Another factor in the hardening off process is the ambient temperature. You're going to want to keep it on the cooler side and simulate the outdoor environment that you're going to put it in as close as possible. A lot of the time, I know people will start seeds with heat mats. I recommend it a lot of the time with veggies and things like that, especially tomatoes, if that's why you're here. Use a heat mat for tomatoes, absolutely. Once they sprout, though, for the most part, I recommend taking them off of the heat mat and actually trying to store them in a cooler environment, almost 50 to 60 degrees, and grow them in that. If you don't, and if you keep the soil too warm, a lot of the time the plants will just think this soil is great and they'll grow up very quickly and not root strongly. So you'll end up with very weak plants when you put them outside that, again, just aren't acclimated to that climate. So you do want to start trying to simulate the spring air temperatures, or whatever air temperature that you are eventually going to put them outside. You don't want them ready for 40-degree temperature if it's going to be 60 outside, but you also don't want them used to 75, 80-degree soil if it's not going to be that when they go outside. All plants, of course, once they germinate and get leaves, are going to need some light to grow. As far as how much light and what lights you're going to need, it varies depending on the plant. You should, once the seeds germinate and sprout and start to grow, you should be able to tell pretty quickly, especially if you get wind on them at all, if you get air movement on them as soon as they sprout. If they start to still grow really skinny and white and yellow, you don't have enough light on them. Moving them closer probably won't help so much either. You need more lumens, which is the big factor as far as grow light. As far as the timing for lights goes, it also is going to vary a bit. I will say that you do not want to have the lights on for longer than they're going to get sunlight outside. I do start to scale up the lighting by about a half an hour as it gets closer to going outside, but I don't ever put the lights on for longer than the sun's going to be out when the plants go outside. Because again, I'm trying to simulate the exterior as much as possible in here. So when I put them outside, they're ready for it. For watering, this is certainly, I will say, the part that most people have trouble with. I know I certainly did when I first started growing inside. It can be tough to regulate, but I'm going to give you a pretty easy way. Soon after the babies sprout, when I first take the humidity dome off and I first put a fan on it and get the air moving, if it's a wee little baby and I don't think underwatering is going to help it very much, I might give it a squirt or two and water it from the top a couple times. But other than that, I really don't. The trick really with growing indoors in these kind of pots is actually to underwater, and all that is using a solid tray underneath these slitted cups and filling up the tray underneath with water. By the miracle of physics that I don't understand well enough to explain to you, the water will actually rise up through the pot and soak the entire thing. And some of these actually got it this morning, and the pots are nice and dark on top, but I didn't water in the top at all. So you definitely want to underwater. When you do underwater, you want to fill up the tray underneath. You want to see the soil on the top of the pot get moist. But once you see that, you don't want excess water in that tray. So if you have to, usually if it happens to me, I'll usually just switch the pods into a different tray and just dump out the water. It just seems to be the quickest way for myself. But either way, when you are underwatering, you want to make sure that you don't keep it swampy, because you want the plant to get water. You also want that soil to dry out so that the plant knows it has a potential to dry out and will continue to root stronger. Last but not least, fertilizer. I use liquid fertilizer because there's nothing that the plant needs to absorb that and take it up. And that actually, believe it or not, that is a factor when you're growing inside. If you use, say, a time release fertilizer or some forms of fertilizer, organic or synthetic, sometimes there are microbes or things that exist in normal soil that break those down and allow the plant to take it up. Whatever fertilizer you do decide to use in the indoors, just make sure it's not that type of fertilizer. You want something that the plant can easily take up quickly without needing any other activation of the fertilizer, because you'll be fertilizing and wondering why nothing is happening at all. As for the consistency of watering, you want to do it very sparingly and be careful. Believe it or not, it's better to have these pots dry up a little bit in order to strengthen the plant and not rot the roots, have fungus gnats. You do want to let them dry out a little bit. If one is struggling and dry and the rest of the tray seems fine, just spray that one a little bit, water it, keep it along. But you want to err on the side of caution when it comes to watering, because one mistake that I made very much and a lot of people do is overwatering inside. So there are a couple of beginner thoughts that can be mistakes that I just kind of want to touch base on here. One is the amount of growth you have above ground in the pots doesn't necessarily indicate what's going on underneath. So if you have slower growing plants, whatever you're growing, having a huge plant doesn't necessarily mean that it's rooting well underneath, and having a small plant doesn't necessarily mean that it's not rooting well underneath. You definitely don't want to look at a plant and say, oh, it's this big huge plant above ground, so that means it's doing great underneath. It definitely doesn't, which can be a little bit tricky. But don't be afraid to pull some plugs and check some stuff at this point too, because it's also important to kind of get to know what you're doing with the experience. I've lost plenty of plants just trying to learn new things, and I don't have a problem with it because it's a cheap lesson. A seed pack isn't all that expensive. It's not going to kill you to plant a tray and lose it, trust me. So feel free to poke around a little bit and learn the lesson. Another one that I'd like to address is the fear of burning seeds with fertilizer. Now, though this is true, and you can burn seeds and have problems, and the question of when should I start ferting? Is it too early? And with the liquid fertilizer that I've used, believe it or not, I have started fertilizing plants and then a month later had new plants pop up. And that's actually happened with the lupins that are right here. I actually have a couple that sprouted recently after they've been fertilized for about a month. Once you start the hardening off process, you're probably going to have some losses, and it can be one plant in a tray or it can be all but one plant in a tray. Don't lose heart. It's going to happen. There's a lot of factors that you can't control, and growing inside is hard enough, but there's things like genetics and poor seed formation in the seed itself. There's a lot of things, but it's better to find that out now as opposed to baby the plants along for 2 months, and then when you go to put them outside, they all just flop over and die anyway. So even though hardening off is going to cause a little bit of losses a little bit early on, don't panic in that, because it's much better to find out now than it is later. Moving along, we're underwatering, we got a fan on them, we have our schedule going, we're ferreting, everything's good. So of course the next question is, when do we transplant them up? That is also going to vary on the plant. I will say, don't be shy to check a little bit. If you have ones that do seem to have some healthy growth, don't be shy to pull that plug up a little bit and just see. Even if it starts to not come up and it feels like the whole plug might not, and you might pull the plant out of that pod, leave it be. Then you know it's too soon. If you pull the plug out and it comes out in one piece, it's pretty much time to go. At the same time, if you pull the plug out and it just seems like there is enough root in there that it's about to reach the boundary of the pot itself, that's about the sweet spot of where you want to transplant it. You don't want the baby plant to be root bound in that single pod, but at the same time, you don't want it to be so underrooted that it's not ready to transplant at all. I will say, whether you transplant a little bit early or a little bit late is not necessarily super detrimental, as much as it's just going to slow down growth a bit. Now, I've absolutely done both. I have transplanted full pods and I have teased plants apart and transplanted those in separate pots. And most of the time, they do just catch up to each other. So it's not, when to do it is not as much of a nightmare again as it's thought out to be. The problem really lies in doing it too soon. So you don't even want to think about transplanting at least until you have the second set of leaves. So like I said before, you'll have the first set of dew leaves or cotyledon leaves that will pop out, and then the second leaves, which are the first adult or true leaves, will pop out. And you don't even want to consider it at least until that second set of leaves is matured and out. If you have to before that, you can try it. You're probably going to incur some losses, but you're probably still going to get some too. It's one of those things. There's not a huge perfect window of where exactly you should transplant everything, and that's why it can be tough in a way. But that is also why I like to use these little pods, because it does give me a good idea and a small amount that I can check on a regular basis without necessarily disturbing the whole entire plant. Now that you know it's time to pot up and you're ready to get going, it's also really time to start considering particulars of the plants a bit more, as far as what soil it does like. For me, everything that I've grown here likes more acidic soil, so peat and perlite is no problem for me to pot these up into. If there are plants that you're growing that prefer alkaline soil, then you're going to want to consider that. Start using less acidic ingredients. I know most veggies, the tomatoes, your peppers, your pumpkins, and things like that are fine with acidic soil and actually prefer it. So it's okay to use most of those with peat and perlite, the same mixture that was the seeds were started in. The other factor that you want to start considering is the depth of the plant. These will grow up to be 5 feet tall, believe it or not. So I want to make sure that once I pot these up, I pot them in a little bit of a deeper cup, as opposed to the mums, which will root lower to start for quite a while. So I can just put them in this shorter depth cup. But you want to start considering that. For the most part, really the rule of thumb is if it's a very tall plant, it's going to want a deeper cup. Simple as that. Tomatoes are an exception here, believe it or not. If you're starting tomatoes in pods, you don't want to go to something just this deep. You want to go to the old fashioned party cup. One thing I will say, if you use anything like this, don't put a hole in the bottom of this, because when it sits on something, the water will just collect, and if it's on a non porous surface, it won't drain out anywhere. So you want to hold the top like so. I think I did smaller square ones, but you use a razor blade and you can just cut down the sides and just put slits in the sides to make sure that the water can actually drain out. But tomatoes are the one exception. You want to make sure you use those in a bigger cup. Now we're on to the actual work of potting them up. Personally, I prefer to have the pods damp when I transplant them, but not totally soaking. I want to try to have them at a damp consistency in the hopes that it will bind the soil together while the plug is being transplanted. At the same time, if I plan on teasing the plants apart and planting them individually, I usually won't do that because I want to easily be able to pull those roots apart and not have them clump together or anything like that. If you are going to transplant the whole entire plug, you are going to want to deable out a big enough hole to make sure that you do that. The way that I do it, I usually fill the pot up as I normally would, and then I'll use a pencil to start a small one and just swirl around in a circle. Don't worry so much about the mound that will build up on the edges of the hole that you're making. It'll work out once the plug gets stuck in there. But I'll go through the whole entire tray and I'll have those all ready, and then I'll get the plants themselves over. And with these conical pods that I use, a lot of the time, if I'm squeezing from the sides, if I'm lucky enough to get most of the pod out, I'll see the top of it hop a little bit up, which makes it easier for me to know that that pod is loose. You want the pod to feel more like it's sliding out of there rather than you're pulling it out of there, especially if you're holding it by the plant itself, because you will end up snapping a couple of plants. I have too. It happens to everybody. But you do want to try to slide more than pull it out as much as possible. When you're actually putting the plug into the pot, as I said, there'll be a little bit left over on the side, but if you can get the whole plug in there and you just push down on the edges of that plug where they meet the side of that hole, it'll all line up pretty perfectly and be nice and snug in there. And it won't be a whole lot of pressing down around and prettying it up. If you're teasing them apart, you do want to dibble down far enough to make sure that the plant knows that it's got root. You don't want to make a small hole and have the root bound up at the top of the pot, believe it or not. You want to go deep enough. And most importantly, if you are separating plants, you want to make sure that the surface of the soil is the same spot. So if you're teasing all of the dirt off, when you're burying the root and the plant only in new soil, there is that line that the plant knows as the line between the soil and the air, and you want to be 100% sure that you keep that the same. Once the plants are all repotted and up in their new homes and comfy, I will usually be sure to give them a little spray on the top with water just to wash the leaves off in case any dirt or anything got kicked up on them. It is one of the few times that I will top water the plant from now. And I'll also be sure to underwater it after that. This is also one of the few days where I'll usually give them a day or two off from the fan, at least a day. I'll give them a day off from the fan just to let them root, relax, and get comfy. A lot of the time, when you do pot them up, you'll see them lay down. They'll look like they are hurting, and don't worry about that too much because within a day or two, they'll start perking back up and feeling pretty good about life. At the same time, just like with the last process, when you do this, you're going to incur some losses. Don't panic. It's okay. I will say, with that thought in mind, as far as thinning out goes, if you planted, say, if you did tomatoes and you planted two per pod or three per pod in the small little one like this, and three of them came out, I don't usually thin them until after this stage, until they get up into these pots that they're going to hang out in for a while. And you can even see with these, with the Elysium and these mums, some of them, there are still a couple of plants in there. And the reason for that is, if if these were in those tiny pods and I thin them all out down to one per pod, and then I transplant one into this and it dies after this transplant, well, now I have a dead pot that's useless. As opposed to, if I have two or three, then if they transplant into this and one dies, then there's already another one there, so it's okay. This is the point, once they accept this point in these, 3 and 4 inch pots, once they get to this point, after this, when they get healthy and growing again, that's when I will start to go trim them down and do one per pod when I'm almost positive it's going to make it. It's a personal preference. If you prefer to do it earlier, nothing against it, no worries at all. It is just, it's a perfect personal preference of mine to try to wait as far as I can down the road to thin them out to one per cup, because it just, in my experience, gives me better odds of at least ending up with one per cup throughout the season. Now, once I'm at this point, for the most part, these plants are going to stay in these pots until they go outside. I will absolutely have a follow-up video for that to show how they all worked out and how I start prepping them by putting them outside. That's pretty short and sweet and simple, but there will be a video on how to do that. And again, the overall point of this part of the process is to start trying to simulate outside. As always, if there's any questions, anything I can do to help information wise or at all, feel free to drop a comment, let me know. I'm always here to help. Best of luck, happy growing, and as always, be kind to each other. Thanks, folks.